Hey guys, this is Alachi, and this is my review for Cat Person. Cat Person is one of I think, the most divisive films of this year that no one will see because no one's going to see this. I don't know if it was the distribution company that made this so that this is not really getting any wide release, or if the distribution company is concerned with the allegations that have come forward about Nicholas Braun and his use of his bar to lure in possibly underage women, and the allegations behind that. If they didn't want to deal with that, and so they're just like, let's just tuck this movie, like nice in a little corner. We did it, we made it, but no one really needs to see it until it comes out, on streaming or something like that. I don't know, because I feel like this is a really, really interesting film. From the concept to how they actually decided to execute it, completely controversial in my opinion. And I think, but in a very interesting way, in a way that I want a ton of people to watch this so that I can have discourse with them, be like, what do you think about their decision to do this? What do you think about what they were saying when, Susanna Vogel decided to portray or to go in this direction with the film? I think this is one of those films where I'm just like, I want to have discourse about this and no one's going to watch it. So frustrating. So Cat Person is directed by Susanna Vogel and written by, it's based off of a short story by Kristen Roupenian that went viral, that she wrote in The New Yorker, and then adapted for this movie by Michelle Ashford, which we'll come back to that. Fascinating what she decided to do with this short story and, add her voice to it, which I think a lot of people are going to find either they're going to love it or they're going to hate it. It stars Emilia Jones as Margot, Nicholas Braun as Robert, Geraldine Viswanathan as Taylor, the best friend of the main character, Margot, and Liza Koshy, who also is kind of like one of the dorm mates. And the short story that this movie is based off of, that went viral in The New Yorker, was all about the perspective of a young woman who is, a 20-year-old college student working at an independent film theater who kind of starts to strike a fancy in her head about one of the patrons who comes in, who's kind of a much older man. They eventually exchange phone numbers, and she starts to text him. And they kind of build up this relationship through texting, and as well as that generally tends to go. And then she finally decides, they're going to actually meet up, and she's going to see if she wants to pursue an intimate relationship with this person. And then the juxtaposition between the relationship she had built up in her head from all the texting versus the reality of what it was like when she actually met him in real life. And it strikes all of the fears that I think a lot of young girls have when they're going into a relationship where there is the potential of a relationship with every man where you're like, this guy could be my future husband, the future man of my children, the person who's my soulmate. But then also, this could be the guy who is a terrifying nightmare. Maybe guiding me down to the worst parts of my life where I am, kidnapped, tortured, all this stuff that, goes through people's heads when you're dealing with someone who's basically a stranger. You don't know them, right? And you don't know what their potential is. The potential could be amazing. The potential could be a disaster. And this is something that I think struck a chord with a lot of young girls when they read Cat Person. And I think that was incredibly, I think that's what drove the desire to have this be sold, the rights to the movies to be sold, and that why the movie was picked up and what they decided to do with it. Now, interestingly enough, while this was kind of written by a younger voice, Kristen Roupenian, it was then picked up by Michelle Ashford to actually translate onto film. And Michelle took the story that I think resonated with a lot of young girls as to the naivety of how you approach relationships, not understanding how maybe even relationships work. Your understanding of what you think relationship is might be just based off of films or TVs or what you've seen how your parents interact, or your friends' parents, right? Your scope of a relationship is kind of, hasn't expanded yet. And your idea of people has been somewhat limited yet. You haven't had those experiences in your life that are going to help you understand people better or understand their motives better, and you haven't learned, how people are. You haven't even figured out maybe what you like, right? You barely know what you like and who you want to be, let alone how you want someone else to be for you, right? And I think that all is great. However, that does lead to a lot of what I consider in the short story a series of mistakes that Margot makes. Not really mistakes, but they're just part of learning in life that guide you towards not really having a scope of how to approach a relationship. And you could just leave it at that. You could just be like, well, this is about a 20-something-year-old fumbling through a relationship or a potential relationship, having seen a guy in a certain way, a perspective of a guy, and imagined, what she thought he could be, what he should be, and then imagined who he was when he wasn't who she wanted him to be. And that could have been the end of it. And then at the end of the story, it really does leave you with a note of like, well, I was right, I was right. Men are shitty, men are scum, right? And but then I think that struck a chord with a lot of people who read it, who were like, wait a minute though. All your fears are valid and all of your experiences are valid, but maybe the whole perspective of what happened to you needs a closer looking at from maybe a wiser standpoint, right? From someone who can actually go like, whoa, wait a minute. Let's examine what actually happened. And that's kind of what the movie does. It actually takes the step back. And I think that's why a lot of people are going to be like, you just invalidated the voice of a 20-year-old something, making her, like giving her story, her truth, right? But this is going to be one of those ones where you're just like, actually, what's the real truth? What were the things that she feared? Were they valid fears? Was the villainous, version of a man actually villainous, or was it due to her inability to actually cope and understand what was the reality of the situation? And I think that Michelle Ashford just does such a good job of expanding that story to the point where, as someone who is older and has gone through those dumb assumptions about relationships, it's so nice to have a perspective of a story where someone's like, okay, let's actually not sit there and put a blame game as you're the good person, you're the bad person, therefore that's why this didn't work. It's more like, this is why this relationship failed, and here are all the series of miscommunications that happened that led up to it, which is a very, I think, mature, wise thing to have a discussion about, except it can be very divisive, right? Because then it's just like, well, what about the female voice? What about the young girl's voice? And I'm like, so valid, 100%. I was there. You think your story was the right story. How you perceived a certain situation is valid, but at the same time, there's probably more to it. And, relationship is two people. And yes, while some guys are absolute dickheads, there's probably a reason why you perceive them a certain way. And this is really the case of two people who are miscommunicating throughout the entire freaking movie. The young girl, Margot, is building a relationship up in her head without actually communicating. She's not communicating with this person. She is having a relationship with someone who's not real. She's projecting the relationship she wants to have on Robert without actually getting to know Robert. She's making a fake Robert in her head that she's like, this is the person I want. This is the guy I'm building up in my head who he is, as opposed to like who he actually is. In addition, he's doing the same thing. Robert is making an assumption about the type of girl she is, right? And the type of thought process she's going through. And the two of them are just literally, because it's all via text, they're just projecting upon each other like this relationship that they think they're having, but they're actually not having it with each other. They're having it with their ideal person, right? They're projecting an ideal of who they are, when in reality, they're nowhere near compatible. And even to the point where she's like, what I love about the short story, she's so like embarrassingly honest as a human being, because she's not this pixie, manic, ideal girl on film who's just the cool girl or whatever. She's a person. She's the girl who's like, yeah, I want to go on a date with this guy, but he wants to go see Star Wars, you know? And she's just like, she's screaming in the library. She's like, Star Wars is boring. Just like, but then she eventually texts him and goes like, oh, I love Harrison Ford. Let's go see this film. It's great, you know? And it's so fascinating how we try to fit ourselves into that ideal of a relationship, that ideal of who we think that person wants us to be, right? And then we kind of get lost and we're not even who we are anymore by the time the end of the relationship. We're faking it. We're faking relationships because that's who we think that person wants us to be. So that's who we become, and then et cetera. And then, you know, over the long term, that doesn't work. And I think that, I guess, Susanna Vogel has decided to direct it and Michelle Ashford has written it. It turns into, it's not a love story. It's not even a romantic comedy. It's more like, I want to call it an emotional horror film, because it's not psychological horror. It's more emotional, because you're looking at the bare bones, just stripped down, pure naked form of emotionally, I would say, immature people. And it's just so honest and just so awkward. It's so awkward and fucking honest. You're just like, you don't even want to watch. You're like, oh God, oh Jesus. You know, like, so fucking cringe. And then, of course, the real fears that Margot has about being in rooms with a strange man she's never met before and putting herself up in a situation. I think a lot of girls will relate to that, because, I mean, even to this day, I don't walk anywhere without thinking that someone's going to attack me. Never have. Even coming out of Target, I'm just like, so if someone's going to come try to get me, you know, like I got to get in my car as fast as possible. I got to lock the door, you know, you don't dilly dally with your keys or fumbling through your purse. You get in, you close the door, you lock it, and then you do whatever the heck you need to do. You never turn your back, you know, on the public. There's just so many things as being a female, which I know a lot of feminists don't want to hear this. I'm a feminist, but that we are the kind of smaller of the sexes, right? We're not as strong. And so we have this fear that we could easily be dominated physically, you know, as much as we don't, you know, we don't have control over that. You know, it's just who we are. It's how we were genetically, it's just our genetics. We're born kind of the smaller sex. And it permeates, of course, through a culture that tends to like not hear us, you know, when we speak up about these types of things, don't believe us when we say that these things are happening. And so it's natural that becomes part of the emotional terror we have when we are meeting people for the first time, especially when we put ourselves in vulnerable situations. And I think that that's what's great about Rapinian's story, is that it really shows that kind of terror that a girl has. So it's the juxtaposition of that terror with the fantasy of the possibility of meeting, you know, your soulmate, that combination is so surreal, right? That's so surreal. Like, this guy could murder me and put me in his basement, or this guy could one day I could come home to, and he's cooked me a nice meal, and we have a romantic dinner, and we cuddle up on the couch and we watch movies together until we're freaking 70 years old. Those are the two combinations of realities that we're contending with, right? And I think that that's what I love about the cat person story, is that it is that emotional horror of resolving in your head where you want something to go versus what the reality of where it might go, right? And just then being faced with the fact that, hey man, maybe I'm in a position now where I'm like, oh God, I built this up in my head. Yeah, thank you. It's not, we're not stuck in a basement. That's great. But also, I don't like this dude. In reality, I don't like him. But then you're like, but what's the reality of what you can say? How many of us have stuck through a bad date because we just don't want to be like, actually, I find you really repulsive right now. Your behavior towards me is appalling. You're incredibly toxic, and I wish I could zap out of this freaking date right now. I want to be anywhere else. But then you're just like, you politely go, oh yeah, sure, that's great, thank you for taking me out. I really appreciate it. You don't say, you're never honest, right? And that's what I like about this film, is that you can see her thinking that how she really feels versus what she's doing. And I think that's a very relatable situation, and not just with relationships, like intimate relationships, but with, all relationships. Like I think with women, we tend to apologize a lot in terms of like not wanting to make anyone feel uncomfortable, right? Like you don't want to be the heinous bitch. I mean, maybe some women do, but most of us are just like, we don't want to be the bad guy in the situation, right? Whereas like the honesty of the situation would probably make things a lot better if you were just to go, I'm not that into you. I don't really like being here. I think I'm going to leave now. I appreciate you've taken the time to take me out, but I just don't call me, right? Just don't call me. But that's not how it plays out. And in the mind of Margot, she's definitely gotten to the point where she's just like, oh shit, the guy Robert I thought I was dating or flirting with on text this whole time, no, the reality of who he is, you're just like, oh my God, he's just an awkward older man who is so much older than she even thought he was, which she would have known if she had actually communicated with him. Like I said, they're both projecting onto each other the relationship that they think they want. So they're not even asking questions about each other. It's like, I don't even want to get to know the real you, because the you I've built up in my head is so great. I would hate that to be shattered by reality. When the true tragedy of it is that, had they both been honestly communicating with each other and learning about each other and being honest about who they were and what they wanted out of the relationship, then none of this, would have come to a head. And I think that the message that Michelle Ashford has made by the what a lot of people call the crazy ass third act of this film is that she wanted to say, hey, actually, as much as it's great that Rapinian had this short story that was about, a 20-year-old's perspective, can I just add in that this horrible story doesn't have to be your story as a 20-year-old, even though you are kind of inexperienced, a little bit naive about the way people work. Maybe you can watch this and you can understand, if you just took the time to actually communicate, things don't have to get insanely out of hand. And she actually gives a voice to the male as well, which I didn't think Kat Person would do, because it is a very Me Too-ish type of short story. So for her to go and almost give the antidote to the red pill story, I was like, what? She actually did that? Which is, I think, again, just, I know a lot of girls are going to watch this who love the short story and be like, how dare you? How dare you give the man his own agency, his own voice, and be able to, excuse, such horrible behavior. He's supposed to be the villain of this story. We are supposed to end with all the assumptions we had about him being right? Like the short story ends. Actually, that's spoilers. Actually, I don't know. Maybe I should just be like, this whole freaking video is spoilers, because I don't know how do you talk about the actual true cancellation fodder, which is this film, without actually revealing the end. So I'm going to go into full spoiler territory now, but I'm going to go ahead and say that I'm going to give Cat Person a solid B. I just found this film incredibly fascinating. I definitely recommend you check it out. Just from a vantage point of something that you hardly see in Hollywood, in which they tackle a story where a relationship is all about the gray areas. And it's not a love story that's built in, of the Hollywood dreams. And it's not like a horror story where it's just like, yeah, it's the worst freaking thing ever. And it's about, it's either relationships are always about like the worst, abusive, horrible relationships, or it's about the ideal romanticized relationship. This is all in the gray area, even gray areas of consent, gray areas of relationship building, gray areas of romance, the gray areas of a date. All those things are touched upon in this film, which I think is incredibly unique. Again, I can understand why people would hate this film, having read the short story, because you're just like, oh, it's supposed to end with Margot dumping this guy because she had terrible sex with him. She found him boring and gross. He's about 10 years older than she probably even thought he was, and she's just like, no. I don't want to be with you anymore. And, he takes it fairly well at first. Then he sees her again later on, and then he just starts to build up in his own head. He's living in his imagination as well. And it's really kind of a dissection of like how men and women kind of live in their, create their own little imaginative world in their own heads differently. And in his mind, he's gone the full jealous route and just like, oh, you've probably been with tons of men. You probably think, that this is one other thing. I don't even know why I'm pining over you, because you're just, I was probably just another dude you effed on a Friday, because you're a whore. And that's how the story ends. The short story ends with him calling her a whore, which is it just basically enunciates the terror which she feared the entire time, which was that he was ultimately the bad guy. Whereas Michelle Ashford takes that end and goes, wait a minute, not the ending actually. And then it starts to show that Margot herself is partially to blame, because she's projecting the fact that she wants him to be the villain. She's projecting the fact that he's out to get her. He's capable of anything, because he didn't go the route of like the amazing romantic lover who will become her soulmate. He's gone down the path in her mind, in her imagination, as the stalker who's going to eventually capture her and kill her. And she's constantly projecting that on her vision of him, as opposed to like, what is the reality? And the reality in Michelle Ashford's version is that he's an emotionally stunted type of dude who got all of his relationship techniques and aspirations from Harrison Ford films, where it's all about grabbing the girl and kissing her and telling her I'm dominating you, and that's how you're gonna like it, and you're gonna just swoon over me, which is fascinating assessment of Robert, and that she gets to the point where she thinks he's gonna kill her, so she goes in to put a tracker on his car just to prove that he's going to follow her. He's following me, and I'm going to prove it I'm going to sneak into his garage, stalk him, put a tracker on him, and monitor him, right? And so the crazy's starting to come full circle, right? And then he walks in, he finds what she's doing. He's like, what the hell are you doing? So she tries to attack him. She's trying to defend herself. She still thinks in his mind, he's the killer. He's gonna come and get her. She's the victim, and he's the perpetrator in her mind. And so she goes in and she sprays him with pepper spray. But of course, she's easily like her wrist is easily turned. She's a tiny little girl, and he's just like, "What are you doing?" And he like takes it, and she ends up spraying herself, which then makes her eyes completely bloodshot. Her skin is like all kind of bruised looking. She falls down. She busts her head. And she finally comes to in his living room, and he's like, what the hell am I going to do? what is wrong with you? Why did you put me in this situation? And she's like, well, you were clearly out to get me. And he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so then they end up having this hash out of her telling him exactly what she thought of him and how she perceived their short little relationship. And then he turns around and then gives his honest assessment. And they're finally, for the first time in the entire film, actually being honest with each other and listening to each other. And yet at the same time, they're both in this conundrum, right? She's like, well, I'm stuck in your house and I've done something terrible, but I still think you had the potential to do something terrible to me. And he's like, you put me in this horrible situation where if I let you out the door, anything you say at this point, you're going to be believed because of the way you look, right? No one's going to believe that you snuck into my house trying to plant a freaking, tracker device. They're going to think that I kidnapped you. I was trying to harm you, and my life is over. And it even comes down to it even is revealed she doesn't even know anything about this guy. She knows nothing about his profession. She never asked a damn question about who he was as a person to understand where he was coming from. And it all leads to this insane kind of battle where she's still trying to, escape from him because she still refuses to believe that he's not out to get her. And she's trying to protect herself as you would. If you're trapped in some dude's house and you don't want to be there and he's like, you can't leave because if you leave, my life is over. As a female, you're going to try to get the hell out of that house. You're like, I know that maybe I was part of the situation that got me in here, but I'm not going to stick around for him to resolve this situation, and maybe that leads to me never seeing the light of day again, right? Maybe I pushed him to this part where it's going to get really bad. And it does get really bad. They end up fighting. She tries to escape. He tries to stop her. He's like, I don't want you to leave until we figure out like how that we're going to, how this is going to resolve without me getting dragged to jail and my life being over. And a fire starts and in the basement, and they're trapped, and he basically has this hatch to like kind of like a tiny little crawl space, and he's like, come on, like get in the hatch or she's gonna burn to death. And she's like looking at this hatch in the ground going like, are you effing kidding me? I am not getting in this hatch with you. Then he's like, okay, fine, whatever, this woman is crazy. And then as the fire's coming down, she's just like, oh shit, like maybe again, the reality of the situation starts to unfold on her. And she's like, I think I would rather trust this guy to go in this hatch with him than burn to death, right? No choice. So she gets in the hatch with him, and they kind of huddle down there, almost suffocating to death during the fire. And, the assumption is the firemen find them, and they're both kind of unconscious, but they eventually both recover. And he goes off. Who knows what happens to him? His life is pretty much at this point over, as to what it was. And then her perspective on it has kind of shifted a bit, where she's like she looks to see at the devastation and damage that their inability to communicate caused, and how what she did in creating this imaginary relationship in her head and not communicating with him and not being honest with him, what it led to. And I thought it was very interesting that they went that direction. I know a lot of people were just like, why would you go that insane direction? Why would you lead into like this utter chaos where it becomes almost like too Hollywood to believe, right? Like no way that this story would actually go down because it's so over the top and extreme. But I like that it went the full extreme because it really showed the spiral and the devastation, and turned it into kind of like this metaphor of this fire inferno of relationship just collapsing in on itself, as these two continue to still have the inability to rectify and communicate with each other. And I just thought, I love that symbolism. I loved it. But yeah, again, I just don't know how many people are actually going to see this film. I don't think a lot of people will. It just has gotten no traction in terms of media attention. And I think that the third act makes it so divisive that you can't market this to young women. And because of the first third of the film being so Me Too, you can't market it as a general audience film. So again, very different film. I actually really enjoyed it. I loved what Michelle Ashford did with this film. And I thought it was so uniquely interesting. I definitely think you should check it out. If you're somebody who loves kind of like the anthropological aspects of human behavior and dissecting the reality of who people are versus, you know, how we tend to perceive them or want to perceive them in real life. Because I like the messy. Very few times do you see in Hollywood that they tackle that messiness and without it being like over the top too artsy. And this just felt really well grounded. But again, don't know if it has wide appeal, but check it out if you can, if it comes out on streaming, if it ever makes it to like Netflix or HBO or whatever. I think it's worth putting on. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. And if you'd like to watch more, you can click right here or here to watch more now. Until next time, see you on the flip side.
Thank you.